Okay, so it's another day and another reading space for the same book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So we're on chapter 3. And again, so these recorded spaces are just so that if people cannot access like the hard copy, they could just push play on this and, listen to the chapters. So each chapter will have its own space. So far from chapters like 1 to now, the spaces have maybe been about 40 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes. So it doesn't take that much time. So I'm going to try to read chapter 3 as fast as possible because I got things to do after 9. So I'm going to start with racial zoning, and that's chapter 3. We like to think of American history as a continuous march of progress toward greater freedom, greater equality, and greater justice. But sometimes we move backward, dramatically so. Residential integration declined steadily from 1880 to the mid 20th century, and it has mostly stalled since then. After the Civil War, liberated slaves dispersed throughout the United States seeking work and to escape the violence of the post war South. For several decades, many lived relatively peacefully in the East, the West, and the Midwest. But in 1877, the disputed presidential election of the previous autumn was resolved in a compromise that gave the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, the White House. In return for Southern Democrat support of their presidential candidate, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops who had been protecting African Americans in a defeated Confederacy. The period of Black liberation known as Reconstruction then came to an end. In the South, the former slaveholding aristocracy renewed African American subjugation. Supported by a campaign of violence against the newly emancipated slaves, Southern states adopted segregation statutes, Jim Crow laws, denied the right to vote, segregated in public transportation, schools, and private accommodations, and victimized by lynching and other forms of brutality, African Americans in the South were reduced again to a lower caste status. Plantation owners redefined their former slaves as sharecroppers to maintain harsh and exploitative conditions. Events in the African American town of Hamburg in the Edgeville district of South Carolina were typical of many others across the former Confederacy where white paramilitary groups mobilized to regain control of state governments. Their aim was simple: prevent African Americans from voting. In July 1876, a few months before the election that gave the presidency to Hayes, a violent rampage in Hamburg abolished the civil rights of freed slaves. Calling itself the Red Shirts, a collection of white supremacists killed 6 African American men and then murdered 4 others whom the gang had captured. Benjamin Tillman led the Red Shirts. The massacre propelled him to a 24-year career as the most vitriolic racist in the U.S. Senate. Following the massacre, the terror did not abate. In September, a rifle club of more than 500 whites crossed the Savannah River from Georgia and camped outside Hamburg. A local judge begged the governor to protect the African American population, but to no avail. The rifle club then moved on to the nearby hamlet of Allentown, killing as many as 50 African Americans. President Ulysses S. Grant then sent in federal troops to temporarily calm things down, but did not eliminate the ongoing threats. Employers in the Edgeville district told African Americans they would be fired, and landowners threatened Black sharecroppers with eviction if they voted to maintain a biracial state government. When the 1876 election took place, fraudulent white ballots were cast. The total vote in Edgeville substantially exceeded the entire voting age population. Results like these across the state gave segregationist Democrats the margin of victory they needed to seize control of South Carolina's government from the Black-white coalition that had held office during Reconstruction. Senator Tillman later bragged that the leading white men of Edgeville had decided to seize the first opportunity that the Negroes might offer them to provoke a riot and teach the Negroes a lesson. Although a coroner's jury indicted Tillman and 1993 other red shirts for the murders, they were never prosecuted and continued to menace African Americans. Federal troops never again came to offer protection. The campaign in Edgefield was a pattern followed not only in South Carolina but throughout the South. with African Americans disenfranchised and white supremacy in control. South Carolina instituted a system of segregation and exploitation that persisted for the next century. In 1940, the state legislature erected a statue honoring Tillman on the Capitol grounds. And in 1946, Clemson, one of the state's public universities, renamed its main hall in Tillman's honor. It was in this environment that hundreds of thousands of African Americans fled the former Confederacy in the first half of the 20th century. As the Jim Crow atmosphere intensified in the South, fear turning to hatred of African Americans began to spread beyond that region. Throughout the country, whites came to assume Black passivity and inferiority. Consider a state as seemingly improbable as Montana, where African Americans thrived in the post-Civil War years. In the early 1900s, they were systematically expelled from predominantly white communities in the state. Public officials supported and promoted this new racial order. The removal of African Americans was gradual. By 1890, Black settlers were living in every Montana county. By 1930, though 11 of the state's 56 counties had been entirely cleared of African Americans, and in other counties, few remained, the African American population of Helena, the state capital, peaked at 420 in 1910. It was down to 131 by 1930, and only 45 remained by 1970. By 2010, the 113 African Americans in Helena comprised less than half of 1% of the city's population. At the turn of the 20th century, African Americans in Helena had included an established middle-class community alongside those who came as laborers or to work on the railroads and in the Montana mines. The police officer assigned to patrol one of Helena's wealthiest white neighborhoods was an African American. Helena's African Methodist Episcopal Church was important enough in 1894 to host its Domination Westerns Regional Conference. That the city had Black newspapers, Black-owned businesses, and Black literary society that sometimes drew 100 attendees to hear presentations by poets, playwrights, and essayists. But in 1906, Helena's prosecuting attorney expressed a new attitude of public authorities when he announced, "It is time that the respectable white people of this community rise in their might and assert their rights." Helena's newspaper called the prosecutor's statement masterful and eloquent. 3 years later, Montana banned marriages between Blacks and whites. During this era, many towns across the country adopted policies forbidding African Americans from residing or even being within town borders after dark. Although the policies were rarely formalized in ordinances, police and organized mobs enforced them. Some towns rang bells at sundown to warn African Americans to leave. Others posted signs at the town boundaries warning them not to remain after sundown. A 1915 newspaper article in Glendive, Montana was headlined, "Color Line is Drawn in Glendive." It noted that the town's policy was that the sun is never allowed to set on any niggers in Glendive, and boasted that the town's Black population was now a minus quantity. The town of Roundup posted a sign banning African Americans from remaining overnight. In Miles City, a once substantial African American community was forced to flee by white mob violence. In 1910, 81 African Americans comprised 2% of Miles City population. Today, it has only 25, or 0.3%. The imposition of the new African Americans subordination even eventually spread to the federal government as well. In Washington, D.C., in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, African Americans in the federal civil service had been making great progress. Some rose to positions whose responsibilities include supervising white office workers and manual laborers. This came to an end when Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912. Although he had served as president of Princeton University, New Jersey, and then as governor of that state, his origins were in the South, and he was an uncompromising believer in segregation and in Black inferiority. At Princeton, for example, he refused to consider African Americans for admission. In 1913, Wilson and his cabinet approved the implementation of segregation in government offices. Curtains were installed to separate Black and white clerical workers. Separate cafeterias were created. Separate basement toilets were constructed for African Americans. Black supervisors were demoted to ensure that no African American oversaw a white employee. One official responsible for implementing segregation was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He might or might not have been enthusiastic about segregation, but it was an aspect of the changing national political culture in which he had matured and that he did not challenge. In this early 20th century era, when African Americans in the South faced terror that maintained them in subjugation, when African Americans throughout the nation were being driven from small towns where they had previously enjoyed a measure of integration and safety, and when the federal government had abandoned its African American civil servants, we should not be surprised to learn that there was a new dedication on the part of public officials to ensure that white families' homes would be removed from proximity to African Americans in large urban areas. Unlike public housing, which was primarily a federal program with some local participation, government policies to isolate white families in all white urban neighborhoods began at the local level. As African Americans were being driven out of smaller Midwestern and Western communities like those in Montana, many other cities, particularly in southern and border states, already had large Black populations that couldn't be expelled. Instead, many of these cities adopted zoning rules decreeing separate living areas for Black and white families. The first to do so was Baltimore, which in 1910 adopted an ordinance prohibiting African Americans from buying homes on blocks where whites were a majority and vice versa. Minton Daschle, the lawyer who drafted Baltimore's ordinance, explained, "Ordinarily, the Negro loves to gather to himself, for he is very gregarious." I said that word wrong. We just gonna move wrong, swiftly and professionally, and sociable in his nature. But those who have risen somewhat above their fellows appear to have an intense desire to leave them behind, to disown them, as it were, and get close to the company of white people as circumstances will permit them. The segregation ordinance, he said, was needed to prevent this. The troubles Baltimore encountered in applying the ordinance reflected just how integrated some areas of the city were. Soon after it adopted the ordinance, the city pursued 20 prosecutions to evict wrong race residents. Judges had to grapple with such questions as whether an African American should be allowed to buy a home on a block that was evenly divided between white and Black. A white owner moved out while his house was being repaired, but then couldn't move back because the block was 51% Black. An African American pastor of a church with an African American congregation complained to the mayor that because his church was on a mostly white block, the pastor who succeeded him would be forbidden to move into this parsonage. Sorry, y'all. Eventually, the ordinance was revised so that it applied only to blocks that were entirely white or Black, leaving Baltimore's integrated blocks unaffected. Many southern and border cities followed Baltimore and adopted similar zoning rules. Atlanta, Birmingham, Dade County, Miami, Charleston, Dallas, Louisville, New Orleans, Oklahoma City, Richmond, Virginia, St. Louis, and others. Few northern cities did so. Before the Great Migration stimulated by the First World War, most northern urban Black populations were still small. Nonetheless, support for these segregation ordinances was widespread among white political and opinion leaders. In 1915, the New Republic, still in its infancy but already an influential magazine of the progressive movement, argued for residential racial segregation until Negroes ceased wanting to amalgamate with whites. I can't fucking believe it. Sorry, I had to take a break because amalgamation, that's a Jake word. Ugh, I'm sick. Which is to say, ceased wanting to engage in relationships that produce mixed race children. The article's author apparently did not realize that race amalgamation in the United States was already considerably advanced, resulting from the frequent rapes of slaves by white masters. In 1917, the Supreme Court overturned the racial zoning ordinance of Louisville, Kentucky, where many neighborhoods, including both races before the 20th century segregation. The case, Buchanan and Warley, involved an African American's attempt to purchase property on an integrated block where there were already 2 Black and 8 white households. The court majority was enamored of the idea that the central purpose of the 14th Amendment was not to protect the rights of freed slaves, but a business rule, freedom of contract. Relying on this interpretation, the court has struck down minimum wage and workplace safety laws on the grounds that they interfered with the right of workers and business owners to negotiate individual employment conditions without government interference. Similarly, the court ruled that racial zoning ordinances interfered with the right of a property owner to sell to whomever he pleased. Many border and southern cities ignored the Buchanan decision. One of the nation's most prominent city planners, Robert Whitten, wrote in a 1922 professional journal that, notwithstanding the Buchanan decision, establishing colored residence districts has removed one of the most potent causes of racial conflict. This, he added, was a sufficient justification for a race zoning. A reasonable segregation is normal, inevitable, and desirable. Whitten then went ahead and designed a zoning ordinance for Atlanta, advising city officials that home neighborhoods had to be protected from any further damage to values resulting from inappropriate uses, including the encroachment of the colored race. The zone plan drafted by Whitten and published by the Atlanta City Planning Commission in 1922 explained that race zoning is essential in the interest of the public peace, order, and security, and will promote the welfare and prosperity of both the white and colored race. The zoning law divided the city into an R1 white district and an R2 colored district, with additional neighborhoods undetermined. Challenged in court, Atlanta defended its law by arguing that Buchanan ruling applied only to ordinances identical to Louisville's. Atlanta's was different. Its lawyers contended because it designated whole neighborhoods exclusively for Black or white residents without regard to the previous majority race characteristics of any particular block. The lawyers also claimed that the Louisville decision didn't apply because Atlanta's rules addressed only where African Americans and whites could live, not who could purchase the property. The Georgia Supreme Court rejected the argument in 1924, finding Whitten's plan unconstitutional. But Atlanta officials continued to use the racial zoning map to guide its planning for decades to come. So even when they found it unconstitutional, the city still did it. The city and its city officials still would implement the segregational plan that had already been ruled unconstitutional. That's important to remember. Other cities continued to adopt racial zoning ordinances after Buchanan, insisted that because their rules differed slightly from Louisville, the court's prohibition didn't apply. In 1926, Indianapolis adopted a regulation permitting African Americans to move to a white area only if a majority of its white residents gave their written consent, although the city's legal staff had advised that the ordinances was unconstitutional. In 1927, the Supreme Court overturned a similar New Orleans law that required a majority vote of opposite race neighbors. I just want to say real quick, so what I've read so far in 3 is basically mapping out in different cities that we find now are majority Black and how they got that way through local and state regulation. And that even when they were found unconstitutional on a federal level, that still the people in those areas made sure to uphold white supremacy. And in the way they denied housing to African Americans or charged them more so that they would struggle to maintain housing. So that's what mostly this chapter has been about. I say that's important because a lot of times we'll hear arguments about race and people will say, oh, well, it was the law. It was the law. Well, in places where it wasn't the law, they still maintain white supremacy. So that excuse of people were just following the law, it's already documented that that's not the case. That people knew it was wrong at this time to exploit Black people in the way they were, that they knew it was wrong in the housing that they would give them, the shitty housing that they would give them, right? And make them pay 3 times more. The banks and how they profit off the exploitation of Black people. Everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. And the reason why that's important to highlight is because, again, we're told like this shit is like an accident when it's not. What we're describing is white supremacy and capitalism, and you can't separate the two. And you can't have liberation while those two things exist. But I'll continue reading because, I got to hurry up and get out of here. So I'm going to try to do as few pauses as possible. Richmond, Virginia attempted a sly evasion of Buchanan. In 1924, the state adopted a law banning interracial marriage, so the city then prohibited anyone from residing on a street where they were ineligible to marry a majority of those already living there. Municipal lawyers told federal courts that Buchanan did not apply because their city's racial zoning law was solely intended to prevent intermarriage, and its interference with residential property rights was incidental. In 1930, the Supreme Court rejected this reasoning. Birmingham, like Atlanta, defended a racial zoning law with claims that Buchanan banned only sales of property to persons of the other race, not residents in other race districts. The city also argued that threats to peace were imminent and severe if African Americans and whites lived in the same neighborhoods, that the need to maintain order should trump the constitutional rights involved. After a lower court banned Birmingham's ordinance in 1947, The city claimed that the ban applied only to the single piece of property involved in the court case, then increased criminal penalties for the future violation. The city's commission council president stated that this matter goes beyond the written law in the interest of racial happiness. Birmingham continued to administer its racial zoning ordinance until 1950, when a federal appeals court finally struck it down. All right, so I said I wasn't going to interject, but I'm going to just do it this one last time because it's, to me, it ties into like some conversations I had earlier today. And I literally was just telling my baby moms this. I was like, yo, I felt like the conversations was mad circular, like we weren't moving the needle forward. And what I mean by that is it seems like every time we find ourselves where we find ourselves now, like housing, we're in the middle of a housing crisis, like they explain here in the early, 20th century. We find ourselves in there now. We find ourselves like not affording food. We're going to store, spending like $100 and getting 2 items. Like we find ourselves in these conditions, and we still hear the same rhetoric of vote, just get out and vote. And I'm just like, and even those who consider themselves radical are not necessarily vote and only vote. They're like, yeah, vote and organize. But what they show here is that it doesn't matter how many cases we might win in court, how many of our people we might get into these seats within the system, that the only way these crackers are going to stop doing what they're doing is literal violence. Like there is going to have to be like a response in which we take our freedom and our liberation. They are not going to adhere to any law that tells them, hey, this is unconstitutional, because that's all happened before, and yet they still carry on. So reading that just brought up something earlier today that I was talking about, but I'll continue. In Florida, a West Palm Beach racial zoning ordinance was adopted in 1929, a dozen years after Buchanan, and was maintained until 1960. The Orlando suburb of Apaka, y'all in these words, adopted an ordinance banning blacks from living on the north side of the railroad tracks and whites from living on the south side. It maintained in effect until 1968. Other cities like Austin and Atlanta continued racial zoning without specific ordinances by designating African American areas in official planning documents and using these designations to guide spot zoning decisions. Kansas City and Norfolk continued this practice until the late 1987. But in cities that respected Buchanan as the law, segregationist officials faced two distinct problems: how to keep lower income African Americans from living near middle class whites, and how to keep middle class African Americans from buying into white middle class neighborhoods. For each of these conditions, the federal and local governments developed distinct solutions. So that last paragraph is especially important because, like, again, this isn't by accident. Like, they literally sit down and think like, oh shit, we have Black people who are advancing, who are coming up with alternative solutions, and who are not only surviving, but they're building alternative economies. They're creating co-ops like we read about in chapter 1. They're applying, whether they call it socialist or not, socialist alternatives so that they can survive and make it and thrive. And we can't have that, is basically what that last paragraph described. It's because they understand, in order for white supremacy to maintain, in order for capitalism to maintain, you have to have an exploited class. And that exploited class is people of African descent. In 2014, police killed Michael Brown, a young African American man in Ferguson, a suburb of, oh, hold on. Okay. In 2014, police killed Michael Brown, a young African American man in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis. Protests followed. Some violent and subsequent investigations uncovered systemic police and government abuse of residents in the city's African American neighborhoods. The reporting made me wonder how the St. Louis metropolitan area became so segregated. And it turns out that economic zoning, with a barely disguised racial overlay, played an important role to prevent lower income African Americans from living in neighborhoods where middle class whites resided. Local and federal officials began in the 1910s to promote zoning ordinances to reserve middle-class neighborhoods for single-family homes that lower-income families of all races cannot afford. Certainly an important and perhaps primary motivation of zoning rules that kept apartment buildings out of single-family neighborhoods was a social class elitism that was not itself racially biased. But there was also enough open racial intent behind exclusionary zoning that it is integral to the story of segregation. And I just wanted to point out real quick that in this book, when they talk about, or when they word it in a way where they say, oh, Black people weren't like allowed into white neighborhoods. So we got to make sure that we think critically. Like, it's not so that they can be, shoulder to shoulder with an au fait. It's that to get access to better housing, better quality housing. Because again, in the white neighborhoods, they built houses to last, permanent housing. And then in the Black areas, or the areas they designated for Black folks, that is where the shitty housing went. That was only built to be temporary. Some of them were just barracks. So the access to resources is what they wanted, better living conditions, not just to be next to some dirty non-bathing au fait. So I just wanted to make sure we think of it in that terms. St. Louis appoint.
Also,
Sorry.
Pen, if you need a break, just let me know. I can also read.
Okay, cool. So yeah, if you could, and I can take care of this thing right quick. I appreciate you.
I got you. Um, so we were at to prevent lower income African Americans from blah, 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 blah. The next sentence is certainly an important and perhaps primary motivation of zoning rules that kept apartment buildings out of single-family neighborhoods was a social class elitism that was not itself racially biased. But there was enough to open a racial intent behind exclusionary zoning that it was integral to the story of de jure segregation. Such economic zoning was rare in the United States before World War I, but the Buchanan decision provoked urgent interest in zoning as a way to circumvent the ruling. St. Louis appointed its first plan commission in 1911, and 5 years later hired Harlan Bartholomew as its full-time planning engineer. His assignment was to categorize every structure in the city: single-family residential, multifamily residential, commercial, or industrial, and then to propose rules and maps to prevent future multifamily, commercial, or industrial structures from impinging on single-family neighborhoods. If a neighborhood was covered with a single-family houses with deeds that prohibited African American occupancy, this was taken into consideration at Plan Commission meetings and made it almost certain that the neighborhood would be zoned first residential, prohibiting future construction of anything but single-family units and helping to preserve its all-white character. According to Bartholomew, his name, let me stop. Um, an important goal of St. Louis zoning was to prevent movement into finer residential districts by colored people. He noted that without a previous zoning law, such neighborhoods have become run down, where values have depreciated, homes are either vacant or occupied by colored people. The survey Bartholomew supervised before drafting the zoning ordinance listed the rates of each building's occupants. Bartholomew attempted to estimate where African Americans might encroach so the commission could respond with restrictions to control their spread. The St. Louis zoning ordinance was eventually adopted in 1919, 2 years after the Supreme Court's Buchanan ruling banned racial assignments. With no reference to race, the ordinance pretended to be in compliance. Guided by Bartholomew's survey, it designated land for future industrial development if it was in or adjacent to neighborhoods with substantial African American populations. Once such rules were enforced, Plan Commission meetings were consumed with requests for variances. Race was frequently a factor. For example, one meeting in 1919 debated a proposal to reclassify a single-family property from first residential to commercial because the area to the south had been invaded by Negroes. Bartholomew persuaded the commission members to deny the variance because, he said, keeping the first residential designation would preserve homes in the area as unaffordable to African Americans and thus stop the encroachment. On other occasions, the Commission changed an area's zoning from residential to industrial if African American families had begun to move into it. In 1927, violating its normal policy, the Commission authorized a park and a playground in an industrial, not residential area, in hopes that this would draw African American families to seek housing nearby. Similar decision making continued through the middle of the 20th century. In a 1942 meeting, Commissioners explained they were zoning an area on a commercial strip as multifamily because it could then develop into a favorable dwelling for district for colored people. In 1948, commissioners explained they were designating a U-shaped industrial zone to create a buffer between African Americans inside the U and the whites outside. In addition to promoting segregation, zoning decisions contributed to degrading St. Louis's African American neighborhoods into slums. Not only were these neighborhoods zoned to permit industry, even polluting industry, but the Plan Commission permitted taverns, liquor stores, nightclubs, and houses of prostitution to open in African American neighborhoods and houses of oh sorry in African American neighborhoods, but permitted these as zoning violations in neighborhoods where whites lived. Residents in single family districts could not be legally subdivided, but those in industrial districts could be. And with African Americans restricted from all but a few neighborhoods, rooming houses sprang up to accommodate the overcrowded population. Later in the 20th century, when the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, developed an insured amortized mortgage as a way to promote home ownership nationwide, these zoning practices rendered African Americans ineligible for such mortgages because banks and the FHA consider the existence of nearby rooming houses, commercial development, or industry to create risk to the property value of single family areas. Without such mortgages, the effective cost of African American housing was greater than that of similar housing in white neighborhoods, leaving owners with fewer resources for upkeep. African American homes were then more likely to deteriorate, reinforcing their neighborhood slum conditions. Pen, did you want
Yo,
to?
Sin.
Yeah.
Huh?
Did you want to say
I,
something?
yeah, I could pick up this next section and then it's only like on mine it shows me like 2 pages. And do you want to just go back and forth with sections? I don't know if yours is divided into sections.
Yeah, it is. I could do the
Okay,
section after this one.
cool. Thank you.
Period. Also, that's crazy. Well, I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm not good at stopping the way that you are. To say that, okay, sorry. I'm just,
No, go,
no, I know
go
you gotta
ahead.
go. So, but that's crazy.
No, say go ahead and say it. You're good.
No, I mean, what we just read was that essentially they made Black people live in areas that were zoned for nightclubs, for prostitution, for liquor
Mm-hmm.
stores, for taverns. And then it like made our neighborhoods essentially deteriorate. Like it's all encoded, it's all in the law. Like that's
Exactly.
just wild to read like that. Cause like you could see it, like you peep in the hood and be mad liquor stores, but you don't realize why.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was wild to read.
Not, and it's important that like we point that out too because like chapter 1 and 2 covered, we have been indoctrinated to view ourselves as inferior. So when we see like Black communities that the trash is not getting picked up, or the houses are dilapidated, I can't even say the word, run down because they're unable to maintain them. Like this book tells you why and how, because oftentimes through, of course, indoctrination, we're told to blame ourselves. Like, oh, Black people just can't keep shit up. But then when you look at the laws and the ordinances and the actions of the city's officials and state officials, they literally would say, hey, you as a plumber, we'll give you city contracts or state contracts to jobs that you wouldn't normally have access to if you promise not to do any plumbing for any Black households. So now if you have a plumbing issue in your house, guess what? No plumber in the area will jeopardize their livelihood to help you. And then you need to go buy material at a store. Well, guess what? That store owner has already been told not to sell to African Americans. So houses get ran down, trash doesn't get picked up. Meanwhile, we still get exploited because taxes still get taken out of our check. We still have to travel. Well, they talked about how they had to travel 2 hours to and from work. Like all that shit leads to shorter lifespans, overworked, underpaid, exploited, overcrowded because now we have to double up on homes because we can't buy houses anywhere. We can only buy in a certain area that only has a finite number of homes. So guess what? As those Black families grew, they ended up having to stick like 4 to a house, 3 to a house. And even then they couldn't all get their funds together on a home because they're already paying 3 times what the home is worth, all by design. So I know I said I was going to keep it short, but then I could talk about this shit all day. I'll hurry up and read. Okay. Time is it? All right, let me hurry up. Local officials elsewhere, like those in St. Louis, did not experiment with zoning in isolation. In the wake of this 1917 Buchanan decision, the enthusiasm of federal officials for economic zoning that could also accomplish racial segregation grew rapidly. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding's Secretary of Commerce, Hubert Hoover, organized an advisory committee on zoning to develop a manual explaining why every municipality should develop a zoning ordinance. The advisory committee distributed thousands of copies to officials nationwide. A few months later, the committee published a model zoning law. The manual did not give the creation of racially homogeneous neighborhoods as the reason why zoning should become such an important priority for cities, but the advisory committee was composed of outspoken segregationists, which speeches and writings demonstrate that race was one basis for their zoning advocacy. So that's important because a lot of times people will come at you with stupid shit. Like when you're describing our reality and how these systems of oppressions exist, they'll try to tell you like, oh, well, it doesn't say something racist, or show me where in the law it says nigger's not allowed. And that's the thing. They don't have to expressly say that. I always tell people, just look at your material conditions. If this law exists and says, hey, you can't buy here for this reason, and you're seeing that it's mostly affecting Black people, and how they live or can't live because of this ordinance or law, well, then this is a racist law. It doesn't have to expressly say no Black people are allowed. That's that bullshit they try to get you. So yeah, it's important that again, and they know that too. You know, according to this time, right? They're saying how they didn't expressly put in there that this is for segregation, but everybody in that office and anyone who had a role in this already knew what the outcome was supposed to be. So they knew what their role was. One influential member was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. These names for real. A former president of the American City Planning Institute and of the American Society of Landscape Architects. During World War I, Olmsted Jr. directed the town planning division of the federal government's housing agency that managed or built more than 100,000 units of segregated housing for workers in defense plants. In 1918, he told the National Conference on City Planning that good zoning policy had to be distinguished from the legal and constitutional question, meaning the Buchanan Rule, with which he wasn't concerned. So far as policy went, Olmsted stated that in any housing developments which are to succeed, racial divisions have to be taken into account. If you try to force the mingling of people who are not yet ready to mingle and do not want to mingle, a development cannot succeed economically. And I'm stumbling on those words because I don't want to forget this. So remember, in chapter 1 and chapter 2, they talked about how in these areas where these politicians are, where they're all of a sudden saying, oh, we can't disrupt what already is. Remember, chapter 1 plainly laid out how segregation was imposed in places where there was no segregation before. So they created the conditions and then later on say, oh, well, shit, this is just how it is. So we got to keep going. And it's like, no, y'all created this. You do not have to keep doing this. But yet that's how they word it in there, as though this is something that's all happenstance, something that's just natural in human beings, and that, you know, they're just doing the best they can. And then that's where we get that stupid ass argument that you'll hear in some of these conversations where they'd be like, oh, well, that's just human nature. No, it's not. No, it's not. And like I said, all written down and codified into law. Another member of the advisory committee was Alfred Bettman, director of National Conference on City Planning. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to a national land use planning committee that helped to establish planning commissions in cities and states throughout the country. Planning, i.e. zoning, was necessary, Bettman and his colleagues explained, to maintain the nation and the race. The segregationist, so city planning literally has its roots in white supremacy. Like that's, y'all, like I said, it's not conspiracy, it's history. The segregationist consensus of the Hoover Committee was reinforced by members who held positions of leadership in the National Association of Real Estate Boards, including its president, Irving B. Hyatt. In 1924, 2 years after the advisory committee had published its first manual and model zoning ordinance, the association followed up by adopting a code of ethics that included this warning. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. Again, these crackers set the property values and are telling you that it's just the presence of Black people that lowers them. It's like, no. Again, I think chapter 2 highlighted it the most, that they literally would go to realtors and say, hey, if you sell to Black people, you would be cut out the market. You would be blackballed. And then they said the same thing to construction workers. Like, if you go and you help this Black neighborhood rebuild their house, I don't care if they paid you, you will be cut out of the market. You'll be blackballed. So when they say like, oh, we can't do this because we can't rock the boat, these are the motherfuckers who literally put the hole in the boat in the fucking first place. I hope we have revolution in my lifetime because this is goddamn ridiculous. Anyways, other influential zoning experts made no effort to conceal their expectation that zoning was an effective means of racial exclusion. So I'm real quick, y'all. I'm gonna throw the mic to a few people who might can read because I might have to step away. So if you can read, just request and
Yeah, I got
I'll
you.
approve it.
If people want to come up, but I can take over if you need to go right now.
Cool. I can finish just one section and then if you can pick up the next. And then like if Nitra or Crid or anybody else wanna go, I'll give them the mic.
Period.
Uh,
Y'all, if y'all have capacity, are
mhm,
you have capacity to finish right now, Pen?
mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I could get through it. Appreciate it. Actually, we're almost done too. So I'm gonna stop pausing. Other influential zoning experts made no effort to conceal their expectation that the zoning was an effective means of racial exclusion. Columbia Law School professor Ernest Frunin. You know what? This is an unprofessional audio book, but it is okay to mispronounce Ofe's names. So we just gonna move along. The nation's leading authority on administrative law in the 1920s observed that preventing the coming of colored people into a district was actually a more powerful reason for the spread of zoning during the previous decade than creation of a single family districts. The stated justification for zoning. Because the Buchanan decision had made it impossible to find an appropriate legal formula for segregation, Freud said the zoning masquerading as an economic measure was the most reasonable means of accomplishing the same end. Again, like we already talked about. Secretary Hoover, his committee members, and city planners across the nation believed that zoning rules that made no open reference to race would be legally sustainable, and they were right. In 1926, the Supreme Court for the first time considered the constitutionality of zoning rules that prohibited apartment buildings in single-family neighborhoods. The decision arising from a zoning ordinance in a Cleveland suburb was a conspicuous exception to the court's rejection of regulations that restricted what an owner could do with his property. Justice George Sutherland, speaking for the court, explained that very often the apartment house is a mere parasite, constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential got stuck, y'all, by the residential character of the district, and that apartment houses in single family districts come very near to being nuisances. In reaching this decision, the Supreme Court had to overrule the findings of a district judge who would have preferred to uphold the zoning ordinances, but could not pretend ignorance of its true racial purpose, the violation of Buchanan. The judge explained the blighting of property values and the congesting of the population whenever the colored or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within the judicial cognizance. The years since the 1926 Supreme Court ruling, numerous white suburbs and towns across the country have adopted exclusionary zoning ordinances to prevent low-income families from residing in their midst. Frequently, class snobbishness and racial prejudice were so intertwined that when suburbs adopted such ordinances, it was impossible to disentangle their motives and to prove that the zoning rules violated constitutional prohibitions of racial discrimination. In many cases, however, like Secretary Hoover's experts, localities were not always fiducious in helping their racial motivations. Yeah, I skipped over that word, y'all. The use of zoning for purposes of racial segregation persisted well into the latter half of the 20th century. In a 1970 Oklahoma case, the segregated town of Lawton refused to permit a multi-unit development in an all-white neighborhood after residents circulated a petition in opposition. They used racial appeals to urge citizens to sign, although the language of the petition itself did not mention race. The sponsors of the apartment complex received anonymous phone calls that expressed racial antagonism. In a subsequent lawsuit, the only member of the Planning Commission who voted to allow the project testified that bias was the bias of others commissioners' opposition. Although the commission did not use race as the reason for denying the permit, a federal appeals court found that the stated reasons were mere pretext. If proof of a civil rights violation depends on an open statement by an official of an intent to discriminate, the 14th Amendment offers little solace to those seeking its protection, the court concluded. Yet the appeals court view did not prevail in other cases. A few years later, in 1977, the Supreme Court upheld a zoning ordinance in Arlington Heights, a suburb of Chicago, that prohibited multi-unit development anywhere but adjacent to an outlying commercial area. The ordinance ensured that few, if any, African Americans could reside in a residential area. The city council had adopted a zoning ordinance in a meeting where members of the public urged action for racially discriminatory reasons. Letters to the local newspaper urged support for the ordinance as a way to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods. But despite the openly racial character of community sentiment, the Supreme Court said the ordinance was constitutional because there was no proof that the council members themselves had adopted the ordinance to exclude African Americans specifically and not exclude all lower income families, regardless of race. My purpose, however, is not to argue courtroom standards of proof. I am interested in how we got to the systemic racial segregation we find in metropolitan cities and areas today, and what role government played in creating these residential patterns. We can't prove what was in council members' hearts in Arlington Heights or anywhere else, but in too many zoning decisions, the circumstantial evidence of racial motivation is pervasive. I think it can fairly be said that there would be many fewer segregated suburbs than there are today, were it not for an unconstitutional desire shared by local officials and by the national leaders who urged them on to keep African Americans from being white families' neighbors.
Child.
And if you're ready, choose.
Yeah, child. Okay. So, the use of industrial and even toxic waste zoning to turn African American neighborhoods into slums was not restricted to St. Louis. It became increasingly common as the 20th century proceeded and manufacturing operations grew in urban areas. The pattern was confirmed in a 1983 analysis by the U.S. General Accounting Office, GAO, concluding that across the nation, commercial waste treatment facilities or uncontrolled waste dumps were more likely to be found near African American than white residential areas. Studies by the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Churches of Christ and by Greenpeace, conducted at about the same time as the GAO report, concluded that race was so strong a statistical predictor of where hazardous waste facilities could be found that there were only a 1 in 10,000 chance of the racial distribution of such sites occurring randomly, and that the percentage of minorities living near incinerators was 89% higher than the national median. Skeptics of these data speculated that African Americans moved to such communities after these facilities were present. But while this may sometimes have been the case, after all, most African Americans had limited housing choices, it cannot be the full explanation. Neighborhoods with proposed incinerators, not those already built, had minority population shares that were much higher than the shares in other communities. Decisions to permit toxic waste facilities in African American areas did not intend to intensify slum conditions, although this was the result. The racial aspect of these choices was the desire to avoid the deterioration of white neighborhoods when African American sites were available as alternatives. The welfare of African Americans did not count for much in this policymaking. Oftentimes, as in St. Louis, zoning boards made explicit exceptions to their residential neighborhood rules to permit dangerous or polluting industry to locate in African American areas. Child. In Los Angeles, for example, a Black community became established in the South Central area of the city in the 1940s. The neighborhood had some industry, but its non residential character was more firmly entrenched when the city began a process of a spot rezoning for commercial and industrial facilities. Automobile junkyards became commonplace in the African American neighborhood. In 1947, an electroplating plant explosion in this newly developing ghetto killed 5 local residents, as well as 15 white factory workers, and destroyed more than 100 homes. When later that year, the pastor of an African American church protested a rezoning of property adjacent to his church for industrial use, the chairman of the Los Angeles City Council Planning Committee, responsible for the rezoning, responded that the area had now become a business community, adding, "Why don't you people buy a church somewhere else?" For the most part, courts have refused to reject toxic sitting decisions without proof of explicit, stated intent to harm African Americans because of their race. In a 1979 Houston case, an African American community that had already had a disproportionately high number of hazardous waste sites protested the addition of another. A federal judge found that the proposal was an unfortunate and insensitive, but refused to ban it without further proof of explicit racial motivation. A 1991 case arose in Warren County, North Carolina, whose overall population was about half white and half African American. The county had 3 existing landfills, all in African American areas. When a new landfill was proposed for a white area, residents protested, and the county officials did not issue a permit. But when another was proposed, this time in an African American area, the county officials ignored residents' protests and approved the landfill. A federal judge upheld the county's decision, finding that there was a discriminatory impact but no explicit racial intent. In 1991, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a report confirming that a number of disproportionate toxic waste facilities were found in African American communities nationwide. President Bill Clinton, then issued an executive order did not desperate impact requiring that such desperate impact be avoided in future decisions. The order did not, however, require any compensatory, they try to pay these niggas back essentially, actions for the existing toxic placements. The frequent existence of polluting industry and toxic waste plants in African American communities, along with subdivided homes and rooming homes, contributed to giving African Americans the image of slum dwellers in the eyes of whites who lived in neighborhoods where integration might be a possibility. This, in turn, contributed to white flight when African Americans attempted to move to suburbs.
And
Zoning.
real quick, choose my bad because I know it's almost to the end of the chapter.
I was just
But
trying.
that,
I know you.
huh?
I was just trying to go fast because I knew you gotta go.
Nah, I appreciate you. This,
Mhm.
if I'm late, it's my fault. I can't help it. This book be getting me every time
Nah, they
because,
basically said they was trying to kill us for real, with some
for
toxic
real,
waste.
and
Like
it's
what?
still it's
Sorry,
still
go ahead.
like going down today. Like if y'all go in the South, and I'm not saying it's just in the South, but in the South, right, where oil refineries are, they're surrounded by black neighborhoods. Like the runoff of the wastewater drains goes directly into black neighborhoods in Louisiana, in Monroe, Louisiana. There's this large piping system, right? That all the flooding waters from the neighboring white town all goes into Monroe. So all that flooding water, it just literally floods Monroe every time it happens. Yo, this shit is so like, again, they say, look, we built this for this reason. We knew this was gonna happen. And it's still in effect till today. And we sit there and we tell each other we've progressed and this is progress. And I'm like, no, y'all, I think we've been literally hoodwinked. This shit, we are still in an open air prison. And this book, like, well, what you just read, I mean, further, again, put you on landfills. Like, yo, there's communities that live right by, I know in Atascocita in Houston, yo, there's these apartments. I can't remember what area in Atascocita, but yo, it's right by the garbage dump, and they're downwind of it. And guess who they only rent to? Black people. But guess how much they have to pay for it? 500 square foot apartment is like 1,500 a month, and it goes up by 300 every time you renew the lease. It's crazy, but they make you pay for it. But my bad. Choose. Go ahead.
For real, for real. I'll say more because there's one more paragraph left. Um, Zoning thus had 2 faces. One phase, developed in part to evade a prohibition on racially explicit zoning, attempted to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods by making it difficult for lower income families, large numbers of whom were African Americans, to live in expensive white neighborhoods. The other attempted to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration by ensuring that few industrial or environmentally unsafe businesses could locate in them. Prohibit, prohibited in this fashion, polluting industry had no option but to locate near African American residences. The first contributed to the creation of exclusive white suburbs, and the second to the creation of urban African American slums. Child. So where I grew up, if you're from New York, I grew up in Manhattan. Right next to where I grew up, there is Con Edison. And I used to always wonder, like, everybody gets a Con Ed bill. Why is Con Ed right in the middle of the projects? Because it always just to seem mad weird. Like, it's just a big ass power plant where a bunch of niggas live. Like, why is that? And then I remember when Sandy happened and everybody's house flooded down there, to learn that that's basically landfill down there. Like that didn't exist like when the settlers came. It was all landfills, and they built over housing projects there. So like I'm hearing what you're saying about the South and what the book is saying about the South, and then I'm thinking about New York City. Cause yeah, if you go to the South Bronx, it does stink down there. And it stink down there because it's a garbage treatment plant. But niggas live down there. And it does stink. Like you drive by and you have to close your windows because it stinks. Like yeah, they trying to kill us. They are killing us. And
And
yeah.
two, like real quick, that part at the end of chapter 3 where it talks about, it kind of try to frame it again. A cracker wrote this book, so they try to frame it like, oh well, the other Ofays had no choice but to be scared of Negroes moving into their city. It's like, no, no, niggas, this is what happened. So basically, they watched as the government fucked over Black people and spread propaganda talking about, well, it's these Negroes, they just don't know how to live and upkeep their house. Meanwhile, putting every obstacle in place so they can't upkeep their house in their neighborhoods. And then the other crackers, right, who now are being let into, slightly better living conditions, not too high now because we still need y'all to go work in the plants, right? So these crackers see what's happening to Black people, and they're like, yo, if we sign on to like integration or go against the status quo, which the status quo is white supremacy and capitalism, then we're going to lose our little status. So they had a direct stake in maintaining all this. So what you'll see is that even when ordinances got passed down for integration, the local crackers made sure they did everything possible to terrorize Black people so that no one would want this and so that the system can keep going. So then when people talk about, that's why I tell people to read Settlers by Jai Sakai. A lot of people say not to know. We gonna read that in this space because we need to understand. I have an analysis that I can defend where I don't see any revolutionary potential in O-Phase. I say it's not there. Even if it is, it doesn't make sense for us to keep doing that, knowing good and well that they have more stake in the game. So in any point in time, and we can point to history too, where they will betray us every single time. As long as they get just a little bit of more skin in the game, they're like, oh, well, fuck y'all. And again, we can study the labor movement and all kind of movements that was grassroots where crackers literally betrayed us so that they can get a better position within the buffer class, or even if their class position wasn't even like, they didn't rise above it. They even the illusion of they can be rubbing elbows with the other white bourgeois, they sold out for that. So yeah, I know the book is over. There's 21 chapters in this book. If I have time, I'm really going to try to double up because I would like to make as many books that are in the library accessible as possible so that, you could just press play anytime and just be able to, access this information without, having the hard copy. But yeah, I don't know if y'all want to have a discussion, but I got to get ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and end the space. And if y'all continue another space, I hope y'all do. But it's a very interesting book, just so anyone knows. It's called The Color of Law. And tomorrow I'm going to, read through some more chapters too. So it'll all be accessible by the time we get to the end of the book. So
I'm sure I speak for all of us. Thank you, Pen, for offering the space, offering your time, offering your amazing reading. Like you're so fucking dope. And I'm so grateful. I'm sure we're all really grateful for what you offered today.
now I appreciate you helping me. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the space. And yeah, I'll usually it'll be around 8 or 9 this time every day where you can come in and hear more chapters of this book and future books. So y'all be safe. And yeah, I'll see y'all in other spaces.